Hello and welcome to today's episode of Sambandh Short Takes. In early December 2024, Nepal's Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli made a historic visit to China, breaking with the usual diplomatic protocol that sees Nepal's leaders head to India first. During this trip, he met with his counterpart, Li Qiang. Am I pronouncing that right, Professor J?
Li Qiang.
Qiang? Li Qiang. Okay.
Chaya ka turn. Yeah.
During this trip, he met with his counterpart, Li Qiang, and the two leaders inked a significant 9-point agreement along with several memorandums of understanding covering everything from infrastructure to medical cooperation, trade, tourism, and disaster management. A day before the visit, Nepal announced that it would accept 20 million US dollars in grant assistance from China, a clear sign of deepening ties between the two nations. But there's more at play here. Prime Minister Oli's trip raises key questions, not just about Nepal's foreign policy shift, but also about the growing influence of China in the region. With talks of expanding China's Belt and Road Initiative in Nepal, there is concern in India over the potential impact that this will have on India's connectivity projects in the north. To unpack the significance of this visit, we have two leading experts joining us today. Amish Rajmulmi, editor and author of All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, published in 2021, will provide insights from Nepal's perspective. We are also joined by Professor Jebin Jacob, an authority on China studies in India, if I may say. He's an associate professor at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shivnada University, and he'll shed light on the broader geopolitical implications of this visit. Thank you, Professor Jacob and Amish, for joining us today for the Sambandh Short Takes. Amish, if I may start with you, from your view from Kathmandu, what were the stakes for Prime Minister Oli during this visit, and why was this visit domestically significant for Prime Minister Oli? What were the different perspectives? If you could shed light on that, what were the different perspectives on this visit within Nepal?
Thank you, Riya, for having me. I think so at the very beginning, I think for Oli himself, as the Prime Minister, as the leader, I think there were a couple of things, right, that were at stake. The first was that he had to show that he was trusted by China, even if other foreign partners did not view him with the same trust. And there's, of course, he had to assuage pressures within his own party to commit to the BRI. And I think the third, which is the big one, was also to come to an agreement with his coalition partner, the Nepali Congress, which is opposed to BRI funding via Chinese loans. So you can see that there were multiple sort of like layers to why this sort of significance occurred. And within Kathmandu, you can argue that the pressure to move ahead on the BRI was too great. It had been stuck because of China's funding mechanisms. There were geopolitical pressures as well, but also because Pokhara and Bhairava airports had not been operationalized properly, and Chinese contractors had delayed on a lot of infrastructure projects, right? Then, as with most foreign policy issues, so the domestic narrative usually strings between extremes, and same here. So there was one narrative that said that, go ahead and sign the BRR Implementation Agreement as is. That is the implementation agreement that China had sent, despite concerns from Nepali bureaucrats as well as Nepali Congress. And the other extreme was that not to sign anything unless Nepal's concerns are assuaged. And the Nepali Congress had this stance that Nepal cannot accept any more loans and only grants from China. And then there was the larger debt trap narrative as well. So, of course, I mean, there is critique around the Nepali Congress's stand because Nepal could not single out a particular country. It would do no good to Nepal's bilateral ties, especially because China is also a neighbor. So ultimately, I think overall, in terms of the visit, I think Nepal did a decent job. I think there was a consensus on the revised agreement, as well as the semantics around aid assistance financing modality. So suggesting that domestic actors in the Nepali politics right now, they have aligned themselves on the BRI. And this sort of signals well for foreign policy going ahead. Every BRI project will also be negotiated individually. So that, I would say, is another win for Nepal on this. However, overall, I think that China would definitely be more pleased with the outcomes of the visit, especially with the semantics, the words used around Taiwan and Tibet in the joint statement. So I think that would be my key takeaway from this visit.
you mentioned some very important points, and I'm going to bring them to Dr. Jacob in a while. But you mentioned that the BRI Implementation Agreement was sent before. Can you tell us where it was sent?
No, so China had initially sent a BRI implementation agreement a couple of years ago, I remember, if I remember correctly. And that implementation agreement, there were a couple of clauses that were not sitting right with Nepal, and especially around, and once this whole idea of the dead cat narrative, Sri Lanka situation, Pakistan situation became evident, I think Nepal was very, very hesitant to move ahead on the implementation agreement as is. And that's where, like I said, I think the negotiators from the Nepali side, I must say, there was far more negotiation discussions on the BRI this time around than it should have been in earlier years, particularly in 2017 when we signed the BRI. And I think that's a good thing because ultimately, one of the key issues around any, let's say, foreign policy, like the discussions inside Nepal is that there aren't enough discussions, and it's usually fueled by personal interest. And I think over here, two major parties coming together, coming to a consensus and agreeing that, all right, we can move ahead on this. I think that signals a good, let's say, way forward, a good future for Nepali foreign policy.
Okay. And would you say there is a bipartisan consensus in Nepal's policy circles for the BRI agreement as it was agreed going forward?
I think there is bipartisan sort of agreement that the BRI has to see some progress in Nepal. I think the outcomes of the BRI, as it was promised to Nepal, as Mr. Oli himself promised during the 2017 elections, the whole idea of the train from Tibet, the whole idea of, let's say, like waterways, this infrastructure development coming via China. I think that those promises are being really like sold to the Nepali public. And like I said, there was a lot of domestic pressure also that why are you not moving ahead? Why is the BRI stuck? Why is the BRI stuck? And the constant sort of refrain was that, okay, it requires an implementation agreement. It requires, because China's own positioning on the BRI, which was that it is more of a policy than a project-specific document, right? It was more of in China's declaration of the Pokhara Airport as a BRI, China's declaration of, let's say, like other projects, the ambassador said that any project with Chinese contractors also can be labeled as a BRI. I think these sort of unnerved Nepal, Nepal has traditionally been more comfortable with specific project outcomes. I think, especially when it deals with foreign policy, when it deals with bilateral partners. And I think that was one of the key motivations behind coming to this consensus agreement.
Okay. Thank you, Amish. Professor Jacob, could you tell us about the broader implications for India of China's growing, ambitions? That Amish also highlighted the consensus on BRI that has been agreed to right now. What are the broader implications for India, about China's growing influence and ambitions in Nepal?
Well, thank you, Ria, for inviting me, first of all. I would say, China has ambitions, but to say that it has influence, that's a different thing. I think, as Amish has pointed out, there has been a lot of pressure within Nepal on its relations with China, questions about what the BRI was delivering, questions about accountability, and so on and so forth. So, if China really had that kind of influence, the Chinese would be able to ride roughshod over whatever concerns Nepal had. But that has not been the case. And again, as Amish pointed out, even now the Chinese haven't gotten what they wanted out of Nepal in terms of a BRI acceptance or a BRI agreement. This is just a framework agreement, and the Nepalese are very, very careful and particular about what exactly goes into it. So I think that's the first point that needs to be underlined. Now, having said that, many countries, and I think to an extent even India, make the mistake of viewing the Chinese state as just a normal state. But China is a party state with a very specific ideological view of the world. And Nepal's worldview is, of course, quite different. But with activities like, what has happened in the past, the Chinese Communist Party conducting a training session on Xi Jinping thought for the CPN, UML, and initiatives such as, the Global Civilization Initiative. Nepal has already signed on to the GDI, not to the other parts of these three global initiatives. But there is a risk that unless small states or big states like Nepal or India, don't understand the nature of the party state in China, they risk being pulled into or being used by Chinese foreign policy objectives, which, at the end of the day are zero-sum calculations. And these objectives are targeted at countries like India, the US, and indeed against Nepal's own interests. So if, when China looks at this relationship with Nepal vis-a-vis India, then it's a zero-sum calculation. China, the approach that the Chinese have is that, well, if they have to gain something against India, or if they have to gain something with Nepal, then India must necessarily lose, or vice versa. Right, so that's the calculation. Now, I don't think the Nepalese are unaware of this, but they also need greater agency with, democratic partners like the United States or India in order to be able to exercise greater agency vis-a-vis China as well. And so that, I think, from my point of view, in the India-Nepal context, calls for a more consultative, more respectful relationship between Delhi and Kathmandu, as well as clarity of communication between the two capitals. Now, if India has a problem with China, it cannot, not express that clearly out in the open instead of relying on pressure behind the scenes. I think that's not a working proposition. India needs greater clarity on its own China policy, as well as communicate that clarity to countries like Nepal.
In terms of your, sorry, if I may interrupt, in terms of your previous point on the need to understand the nature of the Chinese party state, this one point that Amish also mentioned that that the BRI framework with Nepal has been signed on a case-by-case basis for each and every project. Do we see a shift in China's approach even on BRI abroad? And, if it is, then what is driving this change? Like, there's been a lot of, we've seen different countries, there have been different negotiations around BRI projects and, some going forward, some not, and some, at different stages. So is there a change in how China is taking BRI forward as well?
So I think there is certainly a change. But this is because of multiple factors. One, of course, there's the international situation, which has turned hostile in many ways, particularly in the economic realm to China, with Western sanctions, the US-China trade war, and so on. But there's also, second, there's also the domestic economic problems within China, which has forced China to rethink some of its objectives with the BRI, some of the scale of operations, I think, with the BRI. I'm not saying that the BRI is disappearing completely. I mean, it is, despite what many people might say, it is a grand strategy objective or a plan, but it's a plan that's quite flexible. A third reason is, well, of course, different countries, including Nepal, have been responding to the BRI and often been pushing back. Nepal, for example, has responded both based on its past experience as well as its own domestic public opinion, right? So I think the larger lesson here is that China is quite flexible and that it realizes it has to respond to pressure in host countries. So at the end of the day, then the onus really is on host governments and host populations to hold their own governments accountable, to see and monitor what the BRI is about. And that is the only way that you have best outcomes for all sides concerned.
Talking about the pressure on host governments and the point that Professor Jacob made, Amish, given the conversations on the different projects happening in Nepal now on ports, on aviation, railways, the conversations going on with China, should New Delhi be concerned about its own connectivity projects in Nepal?
I mean, like Professor Jacob said, it would be a bit remiss to think this BRI framework agreement by itself, erodes India's influence in Nepal or expands China's influence by a large degree inside Nepal, right? Like, for instance, I was just looking at some numbers, and since Nepal signed the BRI in 2017, trade with China has definitely expanded, but Nepal's exports have only reached at 2017 levels now. So which means that in the middle, because of COVID, because of the pandemic, Nepal's exports to China had actually declined to less than the 2017 level. So they've only now come back to the 2017 level.
Closing the borders also have to do something with that?
No, of course, the closing of borders, but I mean, land borders, I doubt land borders, even the last time I saw land borders barely accounted for about 5% of overall trade. I think a larger chunk of the trade is still sea-based. So, like I said, I think there is a growing realization inside Nepal as well that the days of China, disbursing largesse towards infrastructure are over. And you can see this in the updated list of these 10 projects. I think there is a distinct shift towards smaller, more manageable projects. I think there's a distinct shift towards being seen, BRI being seen rather than BRI being focused on large infra or BRI being seen, right? And this is also can be seen in two particular projects or three projects that are targeting leaders' particular constituencies. But whether this suggests connectivity, I'm not so sure, right? So this is why, like I said, I think this bit about project by project negotiation, I think that is a particularly success for Nepal, because there is another thing that you'll notice an evident shift, which is that there's a conscious withdrawal of Chinese interest in Nepali hydropower. And ever since the Indian directive about power purchase, about not being clear that, like Professor Jacob was saying, that India has made its neighbors know that its domestic markets cannot be accessed by China via its neighbors. And I think because of that, Chinese interest in Nepali hydropower has declined. So you can see the larger threads, right? Like Nepal by itself is important for China, but ultimately it has to reach the North Indian markets. And if that market access is denied, then automatically that interest also is withdrawn.
There were also reports that Nepal has not been fully able to utilize the existing Chinese grants. Do you think that is because of China not, there's a decline from China, or is it an internal coordination issue within Nepal?
No, see, of course, lack of internal coordination is always you can always point of it as one of the issues, right? But I think in this particular, especially with respect to Chinese grants, I think the delay from the Chinese sides is also a factor. I mean, I recently, in early 2023, there was a news report that said that more than 80 billion rupees of grant commitments made since 2008 were released only in 2023. And this includes rupees 56 billion that was announced during Xi Jinping's visit in 2019. So this delay is not from the Nepali side. This delay is clearly from the Chinese side. And especially if you consider the delay on this. So the Chinese are expanding the ring road inside Katmandu, right? The first phase has been done, but the second phase has been delayed and it's still not started. And it's not been delayed because of Nepal, because Nepal has fulfilled all its, it was supposed to acquire the land, it was supposed to clear the land. It has done all of that. But China has had to step back. It has had to revise its plans because there was severe criticism around the first phase construction, around safety, around the nature of the highway, the nature of the ring road itself. So there are clear, let's say, issues on the Chinese side towards disbursements of grants as well. But at the same time, if you see, Chinese grants are adequately utilized by local authorities and governments in the border districts. So the grants can flow when they serve China's core interests also. So there is, as with foreign assistance, grants are tied to foreign policy goals. So if, basically, there is a delay in, let's say, Nepal is struggling to utilize Chinese grants, I think the issues lie on both sides rather than just only on Nepal's side.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Amish. Professor Jacob, if I may come to you next. During this visit, one of the outcomes was a joint statement which included Nepal's acknowledgement of China's sovereignty over Tibet and support for China's stance on Taiwan. I read a few articles also that that Nepal used the term Qiang, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Why was this important for Nepal to do? What were the politics around? Can you unpack this development for us?
Okay, so most countries now acknowledge Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, and it's support China's position on Taiwan as well. This is particularly smaller countries, because they are under a lot of pressure, and because they have very little stakes in these matters. But in the case of Nepal, because because it borders Tibet, I think the use of the expression, or acquiescing to the use of the expression Qiang for Tibet, I think is a rather unfortunate move by Nepal. As I mentioned earlier, Nepal has to be careful that it doesn't get pulled into foreign policy narratives set by the Chinese. I know here, ignoring the reality of Tibet's existence and its history by using a Chinese expression, Qiang, means that tomorrow, it sets the ground really for tomorrow the Chinese also ignoring or challenging Nepal's history, Nepal's borders. And, there are some cases already where the Nepalese themselves have complained about Chinese pressure on the borders, Chinese encroaching into Nepalese territory and so on. And there was also this case some years ago about, the Nepalese and the Chinese disagreeing on the height of Mount Everest. And it took a lot of, working or pressure from both sides to somehow come to an agreement. So this is the problem, that, Nepal might have thought that it has gotten its way on the BRI, managed to get a framework agreement, and so might have thought that let's give the Chinese something. The problem here is that there is no walking back from once having created the precedent of calling Tibet Qiang. But China can always pressure Nepal on the BRI in the future. So in my view, this was a rather poorly thought out move, which did not take into account, larger consequences or larger implications.
Amish, on the same question, what are the conversations in Kathmandu regarding this?
I don't think there have been adequate conversations. I agree with Professor Jacob. I think we did not think it through. See, at least, my view is that the government has conceded a large part of its, let's say, outlook, let's say its historical relations, its outlook towards Tibet, to Chinese, let's say, narratives. It has done that in the past as well, and it has continued to do that over here. However, if I think China thinks that, it can replace Tibet by Xinjiang in like everyday usage, I don't think that's ever going to happen here. I think there is a deep-rooted, let's say, historical ties, cultural ties with the Tibet itself, right? And I don't think the usage of the term will become very popular. It is, of course, that. In Kathmandu, as per the debate, I am yet to hear anyone having a large-scale debate around this. And that is also because China has ensured, and I've said this earlier, but China has ensured over the years, particularly since 2008, that the Tibetan issue, that questions of, let's say, like Tibetan dissent, Tibetan political, let's say, activities, did have simply no political buy-in among Nepal's political actors, right? They don't have any buy-in, there's no discussions. And China has ensured that the consequences of engaging with the Tibet question are fair. So, for instance, in the recent past, Nepalese MPs have been suspended by the parties for attending Tibet's parliament in exile, and you can see these sort of pressure tactics, right? And recently, I believe, a couple of reporters from the National News Agency were suspended because they reported on the Dalai Lama being, I think he's being released from a hospital, I think in India. I think he's being released from a hospital. So you can see that government-wise, we have pretty much ceded a lot of ground, like a lot of, let's say, historical ties to the Chinese narrative on Tibet. But like I said, it was, I don't think it was a well thought out, let's say, like point to put into the joint statement. That, as well as the other part about supports national reunification, I don't think we needed to commit ourselves to that extent after having agreed that, in the previous statement, we had said that we don't support Taiwan independence. In the previous statements, we had been saying that Taiwan is a part of China. And I think you can see an escalation in the semantics and towards the ultimate goals of Chinese foreign policy over here. And Professor Jacob would be better placed to say whether it is noticeable in joint statements elsewhere, like, with China elsewhere in the world as well.
In terms of changing semantics, Professor Jacob, to add another question to this, is Nepal recently hosted the 9th Nanhai, the South China Sea Buddhism Roundtable Conference in Lumbini, and yet it prevented or there could have been another situation, I'm just saying as it was reported, China appointed Panchen Lama from arriving there. So how does this paradox play out?
So yeah, once again, I think as with the case of the use of the expression Qiang, to have a Nanhai or South China Sea conference in Lumbini is a case of the Nepalese government giving into a Chinese narrative to sort of buy into the narrative, an illegal, to support the illegal claims that the Chinese have made in the South China Sea, right? So again, it's quite unfortunate, and it's an unthinking move. It simply shows Kathmandu is weak and ignorant of Chinese foreign policy, power plays. It might look like just a Buddhism conference, but for China, the more important part is to show international acceptance, and especially in a major site of Buddhism, international acceptance for something else entirely, which is China's illegal claims in the South China Sea. So I think it's very important for small countries to pay attention to this dynamic. And the question really is, what has Nepal gained out of it? What has Kathmandu been able to extract in terms of diplomatic concessions or any other gains from China for, going along with Chinese formulations on these matters? These are very important matters to the Chinese. Questions of Chinese control over Tibet, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. So if the Chinese government puts pressure on small governments to do this, then if nothing else, the smaller governments or small countries should be able to extract their pound of flesh. But I don't think even that is the case. So it speaks to a larger ignorance and maybe just taking it lightly. But for the Chinese, they'll milk it and extract, because they're going to go to some other Buddhist country and say, look, the Nepalese, which is a sort of home of the Gautama Buddha, has accepted South China Sea claims of China. So maybe that's what all Buddhists should do. Something like that. So, I mean, it's really something for the Nepalese government and its think tanks to, think a little more deeply about.
Amish, would you agree with that Kathmandu needs to do a lot more when it comes to these power plays?
I agree. I think there is a larger sort of, I won't call it discourse, but there is a sort of, you have to come down to how China is perceived in Nepal, right? Like, I think there is a unique sort of Nepali exceptionalism that sort of argues that for China, Nepal is particularly important, in the larger, within its larger, let's say, like land relations, land and bordering countries. But apart from that also, I think there is a particular sort of exceptionalism in the way Nepal also thinks about its foreign policy goals, with foreign policy relations with other countries, especially with China, right? And these sort of statements sort of show that, where they think that, all right, because, I mean, Nepali policymakers who want to think, all right, Taiwan, it's not in a, why should we be interested? Or let's say South China Sea, but we are not even at the South China Sea, and these guys want to do it, then let them do it. But these sort of, like Professor Jacob said, these are important to China as foreign policy goals. And therefore, we have to make a deeper understanding. We have to have a deeper understanding of what it means in terms of symbolism, what it means in terms of semantics, and what it generally means in terms of relations and how others will perceive this relationship, right? And on the, it was a very curious, the very curious thing going on around this South China Sea conference is that the guy who was trying to bring in the Panchen Lama is the same guy who tried to bring in the Dalai Lama as well. So you can see that Nepali policymakers are thinking about balance along these lines, where, okay, if you do, let's say, something for one, you do something for another. And I'm not sure whether balance really means that, or balance really sort of like, you can surmise balance in foreign policy along those lines. But yeah, that is what it is.
As we wrap up this conversation and we are reaching the end of our time, I'm going to ask one last question to both of you, which was which is just on the spot here, but what would serve Nepal's foreign policy? What is the key to serving Nepal's foreign policy interests when it comes to balancing India and China? If we can start with you, Amish, and then Professor Jacob. Just that one thing, just one suggestion.
How do you break it down into one suggestion? I think the one suggestion, or rather the one key takeaway, I think that has happened in this particular, let's say, visit, is that there has been consensus on Nepal's foreign policy. I think there's been consensus on Nepal's foreign policy outlook. And I think that ultimately is very, very important, because in the recent past, we have particularly not been, let's say, agreed upon. There's not been national agreement on, basically our foreign policy has changed as prime ministers have changed, and we changed them a lot. So there's not been any continuity. Now, if this consensus, if this sort of method of, arriving at, let's say, a foreign policy decision can be, let's say, a template or set a precedent for things moving ahead, of thinking about things in further detail, of putting things up for discussion, let's say, within parliament, or opening up for transparency, I think that is, let's say, a great, let's say, precedent to start with. How it goes on from here on, I cannot say. But for now, I think that is a key takeaway from the visit for sure.
Thank you, Amish. Professor Jacob?
Yeah, I think I agree with Amish. I think one of the problems that Nepal has always faced in its foreign policy towards China and India has been the very fractious nature of domestic politics. And this consensus, I think, is a very big step forward in achieving some semblance of balance in Nepalese foreign policy, as well as its ability to, balance players, as you pointed out. To this, I am going to add that especially when it comes to China, and I think this is also true of India, there has to be greater domestic expertise within Nepal on China, right? I mean, there's a lot of Nepalese going to China, studying in China, but I don't know if that translates necessarily into informing government policy. And, this is true of all countries, by the way, dealing with complex polities such as China. I mean, Nepal, India is very easy. Everybody understands Nepal, India. I think even the man on the street has a view. But on Nepal, China, that's far more complicated. And I think that level of mystique or complication on China is what we need to remove. And that might help Nepal in its foreign policy a heck of a lot better.
Excellent. So on this note of consensus, balance, and bridging the knowledge gap, I'd just like to thank both of you for joining today for the second episode of Sambandh Short Takes, and hope to see both of you in person in New Delhi at CSEP as well soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you, Amish.